Over 20 years since the release of Metroid Prime, there's still the urge amongst fans to once again don Samus's visor and explore uncharted worlds. Although the series wrapped up a story across a trilogy of games and a smattering of spin-offs, one of the most anticipated releases remains a fourth mainline Metroid Prime. Teased at E3 2017, the game remains in development, and at the time of this video's writing, there's still no visual evidence it exists. Yet there is a palpable excitement at what could be. The recent release of a fully remastered Metroid Prime 1 has been a keen reminder of what made the original such a delight, brought up to date with a new coat of paint and modern controls. The accredited developers of this remaster have little crossover with the original Metroid Prime team, and it's likely this remake was to acquaint themselves so that lessons learned can be applied to Metroid Prime 4. But here's the thing, it's been 16 years since the release of Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, 7 since the release of the last Metroid Prime game, Federation Force, and over 18 months since Metroid Dread, the latest title in the main franchise. In that time, the games industry has evolved through new technology, concepts, and trends. And whilst the developers could just recreate Metroid Prime 1 again, they'll also need to appeal to a whole new audience who have grown up in a post-Prime world. This isn't to mention fans of the original trilogy, the new Metroid games, and those who might only know Samus from Super Smash Bros. Making everyone happy will be a big task to undertake. So, as YouTube's hot cider, I'm going to lend a helping hand. As I can't evaluate a game that doesn't yet exist, this video will be a wish list of sorts for what Metroid Prime 4 could be. Using the remaster as a starting point, we'll analyse the strengths and weaknesses of Metroid Prime to propose some design ideas for a brand new outing. Some concepts will be inspired by the entire trilogy, the 2D games, and even other first-person games. For people in the future who have finally seen or played Metroid Prime 4, let this be a historical footnote of how right or wrong I was. However, if your aunt or uncle works at Nintendo, then please send them this video. Released in 2002, Metroid Prime not only marked a return of the storied franchise 8 years after its SNES release, but it changed people's expectations of both Metroid and Nintendo. Developed by Austin-based Retro Studios, Metroid Prime presented its action not from a side-on perspective, but instead from the eyes of Samus Aran, shifting the action and formula into the realm of the first-person shooter. An outside developer turning Samus into the Doomslayer was a risky proposition for returning fans, but fortunately Prime had plenty going in its favour. Retro was formed by ex-Iguana Entertainment staffers best known for Turok Dinosaur Hunter. Shooting was of course part of the equation, but so was first-person platforming and exploration. Turok had a bigger brain than its reptilian antagonist let on, making it stand out at an era where the FPS was starting to come to fruition. But it was with the Metroid license that the developers had further opportunity to innovate. Those special abilities of previous games returned, adding unique traversal and combat options. The Morph Ball, for example, often starred in its own 2D platforming sections that broke up stretches of on-foot traversal and combat. But perhaps Prime's most important addition to both the Metroid and FPS formula were investigative elements driven by Samus' scan visor. Not only did this new view activate buttons and highlight environmental puzzles, but it was also a delivery system for storytelling. Every enemy, prop, and computer terminal is giving lovingly written lore entries, which flesh out not just the world Prime was set in, but the entire Metroid universe. Speaking of the world, Metroid Prime naturally follows the lock and key structure of previous games. Not a linear corridor shooter, though featuring plenty of arenas, Metroid Prime asks players to slowly explore the world to find points of interest, and backtrack through previously explored areas to open up new opportunities. As such, the setting of Talon 4 is designed with distinct regions, both in their visuals, construction, and dynamics. There's the requisite wetlands, drylands, icelands, and lethal lava lands, each with memorable locations that play into the Metroid need to remember cool landmarks. For example, all those metallic, Morph Ball-sized tracks that'll pay off once Samus acquires that upgrade. Like previous Metroids, the world also becomes a lot faster to navigate the more powerful Samus becomes. The lethal lava caverns that stretch the entire length of the planet become a handy navigation hub as she becomes fireproof, greatly reducing the amount of backtracking. Finally, Metroid Prime's most memorable facet is its atmosphere, or in simple terms, its look and sound. Super Metroid was celebrated for its quiet solitude, and Retro Studios used that as the starting point for their adventure. There are monsters aplenty, but they are simple-minded creatures that naturally inhabit the world. Over the course of the adventure, Samus will encounter crumbling ruins overtaken by nature, take in stories of a long-lost civilization undone by their hubris, and pick away at a conspiracy involving a seemingly sentient radioactive substance. All the while, musical pieces naturally complement her surroundings. The atmospheric synths of old ruins, the rousing bombast of lava-filled caverns, and the electronic scratches that punctuate combat with the space pirates. Using the opportunities of the FPS, Samus becomes a more dynamic presence in Prime also, as her visor reacts to electrical disturbance and changes in humidity. It's a small touch, but one that massively grounds her and the world. To boil down Prime's core appeal, it's essentially the same as a 2D Metroid game. The lock and key structure, cool power-ups, freeform exploration, and alien shooting action. What Prime further adds to the mix is investigative and storytelling elements through both a first-person perspective and the scan visor. Also, by shifting Metroid to a fully 3D realm, the opportunities for platforming and navigation are expanded. Metroid Prime makes a strong first impression, and would go on to be one of the GameCube's most celebrated titles and a launchpad for an entirely new franchise. Metroid Prime's new remaster has been a great opportunity for players to explore one of the finest adventures crafted in video games, either again after so many years or perhaps for the first time. One feature that has made the remaster more appealing to these players over seeking out the GameCube original is its new play control. Samus now has independent movement and aiming akin to a modern first-person shooter, a feature first implemented in the game's Wii re-release but applied to a modern controller interface here. Exploring Talon 4 twice for research has illuminated just how enormous a change this has been for Metroid Prime, and how huge an effect a new control scheme could have on Metroid Prime 4. Although the remaster has polished up the game's look and feel, Metroid Prime's core design was left untouched, including a few of its unfortunate blemishes. Outside of some awkward backtracking, including a last-minute fetch quest that kills the game's pacing, nearly all of these issues boil down to concessions made for Metroid Prime's original control scheme. Metroid Prime for the GameCube hadn't yet figured out the twin-stick control scheme that would go on to be the genre default. In fact, Metroid Prime is almost exclusively single-stick. It performs double duty, walking Samus forward, back, and rotating her during normal gameplay, but when the left trigger is pulled in, it instead manipulates her aim, locking her in place. It's a control scheme familiar to the once GameCube exclusive title Resident Evil 4. Ironically, RE4 was also remade in 2023 to replace its modular movement and aiming controls with a more modern control scheme. Due to this restriction, Metroid Prime takes great measures to ensure modular movement and aiming is never an issue. Tank controls mean Samus moves a little slower, and so enemies are balanced to have more obvious attack patterns. Jumps are also floatier to make lining up platforms an easier challenge. But perhaps the biggest remedy implemented to getting around Prime's lack of independent movement and aiming is an included lock-on feature, allowing Samus to constantly track an enemy's position without disrupting free movement. This lock-on was pioneered by Nintendo's own Ocarina of Time, where Link's combat was built around targeting and strafing around enemies to avoid the awkwardness of lining up hits in 3D, and to give these situations a more dynamic presentation. In both games, because the lock-on feature guarantees a shot will always land, instead the combat challenge is shifted from aiming to movement and timing. In Metroid, the jump transforms into a boost when Samus is locked on, meaning that movement is made more robust to compensate for the flattened challenge elsewhere. As the first of its kind on the Nintendo GameCube, lock-on was an understandable inclusion to promote a less tense atmosphere. However, when Prime was re-released on the Wii with pointer aiming, and again with its latest Switch remaster, certain design decisions stuck out. There are some fast-moving enemies that even the most sensitive stick movement can't snap to. Relying on lock-on in these situations felt like a crutch instead of a shift in focus due defensively moving Samus. What was most interesting, however, is how the entire world is built around lock-on movement. Prime has plenty of combat scenarios, but they almost all take place in round or spacious arenas, with lots of room to circle strafe. Entire boss fights are built around foes planted right in the center of a room, especially the one that is literally a giant plant. The entire world is designed in modular blocks. It's obvious when a combat scenario is coming up based entirely on the chip of a room, and a player will soon learn not to expect fast-moving, hard-hitting enemies in tight corridors and morphable sections. As a result, this lock-on focus robs the naturalism of Metroid Prime. This would make sense on the N64, but the GameCube controller did include 2 control sticks. It's in this lower region where players swap between Samus's current loadout, using the D-pad to swap between visors and the C-stick to swap between beams. Both these systems are initially very cool inclusions, but quickly become tedious as the game ventures towards its finale. The visor system was born out of Metroid's shift to a first-person perspective, and in Nintendo fashion the mechanic celebrates this new opportunity. With a tap of a button, Samus can shift between a clear combat visor, where she can lock onto enemies, and an abstracted scan visor that highlights environmental opportunities, where the lock-on instead activates buttons and feeds the player lore. This modular shift between an action and investigative layer is awesome, and the scan visor would end up being Prime's lasting contribution to video games, inspiring detective modes in games like Batman Arkham Asylum. However, its 2 additional visors, occupying the 2 additional points on the D-pad, are unfortunately massive duds. Unlike the scan visor, they are incredibly particular in their use cases, which goes against the design of the best Metroid abilities that can be chained into multiple instances. The thermal visor is used to navigate a singular darkened area and highlight some hidden switches, while the X-ray visor is a solution designed for Prime's most notorious set piece. Unlike those great landmarks that create a mental reminder to return back with new abilities, the X-ray visor is used to see invisible platforms in an area a player won't know has invisible platforms because they're invisible. After this one use, the X-ray visor gets some rare usage in boss fights, ghost fights, and finding the rare missile pack. Similar, the thermal visor gets very little use between its introductory section and the final boss. It's telling that neither returned for Metroid Prime 2 or 3, which instead introduced their own visors to show invisible objects. Outside of changing the game's art styles in a very cool way, these extra visors aren't great puzzle solvers because an invisible object isn't something that can be anticipated for. And because these visors' use cases are so particular, eventually a player will forget their inclusion. On the other side of the controller, the beams reimagine a long-standing Metroid staple. Previously, these beams added new effects to Samus's main form of attack, allowing Laser Blast to pass through solid objects, split into multiple beams, or even freeze enemies in place. In the 2D Metroids, unlocking new beams is an additive process, but it was with Metroid Prime 1 where each became its own separate entity. This is initially a cool concept because the developers at Retro did their best to give them all a unique personality. The power beam works as expected from previous games, but the wave beam was given the properties of shotgun spread, the ice beam was a large blunderbuss lob, and the plasma beam was a precision rifle-like shot. Though they call to mind the weapons of other FPS games, they also had cool chemical reactions, like melting ice or electrocuting enemies. What's unfortunate then is that as the game goes on, beam management becomes more frustrating due to how often Metroid Prime asks a player to cycle through them. This is initially because of how the game handles opening doors, and while this sounds incredibly petty, Metroid Prime is a game where a player will open a door every 5 seconds due to the GameCube's RAM size. Going back to the 2D style Metroids, the additive nature of beams means that opening doors is something that becomes easier as the game goes on. In Dread, for example, once Samus finds the final wave beam, a player can open up pretty much every door that doesn't require a charge or missile shot. In Metroid Prime, a player constantly cycles through the same 4 beams in a colour-matched game. Especially during backtracking periods, this becomes a tedious process. This tedium is then further impacted when, towards the end of the game, the enemies also start to become colour-coded. There's the Space Pirate Gumdrop Brigade, the Metroid Gumdrop Brigade, and they can only be hurt by beam attacks, not Samus's once reliable missiles or bombs. There's no puzzle to be solved in knowing that the yellow Metroid will only be hurt by the power beam, and it will only frustrate players used to the more superior plasma beam. Metroid Prime 3 was designed foremost around a new FPS control scheme with a Wiimote and nunchuck, and as a result beam management is completely dropped. because, like previous Metroid games, beams become an additive improvement. By the end of the game, Samus can freeze enemies with her missiles, electrocute them with her grapple lasso, and melt them away with her plasma beam. These are all 3 distinct attacks at a player's fingertips, eliminating slow beam swapping and, more importantly, making sure that missiles and bombs are still useful offensive options. In summation, Metroid Prime 4 has an opportunity to eliminate the sins of Metroid Prime 1 by fully embracing a new control interface. It doesn't have to include additional single-use visors or annoying beam management to justify every button on the controller, and if it shifts away from requiring lock-on for combat, it can create more unique combat scenarios that aren't set in exclusively spacious arenas. To go back to Metroid Prime 3, which was designed foremost around independent movement and aiming, combat there is a more free-flow and improvisational experience. Fighting the space pirates, for example, players can now achieve headshots and shoot around cover. The speed of aiming also opened up cool new enemy types like a wall of drones a player had to quickly react to like a parlor game. Lock-on was still included, but had a soft element that allowed some aiming outside of a singular point, and activated a tracking feature for missiles. It created a cool decision for players: use lock-on for some perks at the risk of targeting a singular point, or remove that support for total freedom. My initial pitch for this 4th outing is that Metroid Prime 4 should be Metroid Prime 1 plus Metroid Prime 3. In that it should take the positive qualities of the first game, its world design, non-linear structure and atmosphere, and combine it with the control opportunities of the third. The second game in the series is also a fantastic outing, and obviously should be factored into the 4th game's design. It was there that Retro smoothed a lot of bumps in the original Prime's design, faster backtracking made possible by clever shortcuts, and more satisfying combat. Its world was also more intriguing than the first game, due to its shift away from familiar locales. For fans of the entire series, it's their favourite due to how much it improves and innovates away from the other games. However, using it as a basis for Metroid Prime 4 would be a hard sell, considering that the new outing will be many players' first Metroid Prime game. What the remastered version of Metroid Prime 1 has shown is that since the original's release, there's an entirely new generation that have grown up with a literacy in first-person shooters. It's something that Nintendo have learned with the Super Mario series. The Galaxy and 3D games eliminated camera control in a midst to appeal to gamers that hadn't fully embraced independent movement and aiming, yet it was reintroduced with Super Mario Odyssey. According to director Kenta Motokawa, "One thing we thought about is, for example, Minecraft. It's huge with kids, and initially we did think that gameplay with turning the camera around would not be accessible for kids. But it turns out that kids love the game, and so there's thoughts like that went into our game as well." In that respect, there will be expectations players will have for Metroid Prime 4 that'll go beyond just independent movement and aiming. What's interesting is that Metroid Prime remains something of an outlier in the greater pantheon of FPS games. It's a subject that I, the host of Bullet Time, a video game podcast that analyses the shooters that miss their marks, find incredibly interesting. An argument could be made that the reason that Metroid Prime stands apart from other first-person shooters is that it's not an FPS game, but instead a first-person adventure in the vein of Outer Wilds, Myst, or, for those with a stronger stomach, Resident Evil 7 and 8. Although a player will be asked to shoot a lot in Metroid Prime, shooting is the least interesting thing they'll do in comparison to platforming, exploration, and investigation. In that sense then, should Metroid Prime 4 embrace its new FPS control scheme like Metroid Prime 3 did, ultimately becoming an action-orientated game, or strip away familiar elements to focus entirely on being an adventure game, going further than Metroid Prime 1 did? It's an interesting question, and ironically one that even the main Metroid series has grappled with. The first game was initially designed as a Super Mario-like side-scrolling action game, before introducing open-world exploration and item-driven puzzle solving in the vein of The Legend of Zelda. Metroid games since have struck a balance of both, and the subsequent genre games inspired by Super Metroid have changed those parameters to create their own unique identities. What's been interesting then is the new identity that Metroid has created for itself in a post-Metroidvania world, and it's one that many players may expect to see reflected in Metroid Prime 4. In that respect, to figure out this new outing, we need to figure out Metroid's identity in the year 2023. The same year that Metroid Prime released on the GameCube, a direct sequel to Super Metroid was also produced for the Game Boy Advance, by the team behind Wario Land 4. If Metroid Prime could be described as Super Metroid in a first-person perspective, then Metroid Fusion was instead Super's antithesis. In fact, the game's main antagonist is Samus as she was in Super Metroid, an overwhelming and silent monster that stalks a radically redesigned Samus Aran. Designed foremost around the strengths and weaknesses of its target platform, Metroid Fusion features smaller, interconnected open worlds that initially are linear in their completion. This is in comparison to a map that grows larger as Samus gains new abilities. Super Metroid was designed foremost around long sessions in front of a television, whilst Fusion was built for shorter bursts of portable gameplay. As such, there isn't the need for Prime's landmarks to remind players where a new ability could be used, because Fusion more directly funnels players from one set piece to the next. To compensate for this more direct exploration, Metroid Fusion is a far more active gameplay experience. Samus has been redesigned both visually and dynamically, as her now slimmer build allows her to grab onto ledges and quickly move around the environment. Combat is also given a higher priority. Enemies are literally made more aggressive by a creature called the X-Parasite, and unlike the item drops of previous games, they now have to be actively pursued to heal and replenish Samus. Bosses are also given a greater emphasis in Fusion. Each builds around one of Samus' special abilities as a demonstration of her awesome offensive capabilities. It's likely that this new identity might have been inspired by Samus' inclusion in Super Smash Bros. For the N64, which was her only appearance on that console in between these two landmark releases. If Super Metroid is a large puzzle to be solved, then Fusion could be described as a number of smaller puzzles that eventually combine together. These are driven by isolated exploratory sections and a new focus on action set pieces. It's different, but the DNA of Metroid persists. In a funny way, Fusion is the more action-orientated experience that players may have feared Prime could have been with its FPS credentials. Where games like Hollow Knight have since focused on Metroid's expansive exploration, and the Ori series on its utility-driven platforming, this new identity for Metroid has evolved across several 2D games. A remake of Metroid 1 from the same team lessened the linearity of Fusion and realigned its identity more to familiar trappings, creating a pseudo-mechanical remake of Super Metroid that benefited from Fusion's speed and aggression. However, it's been under the direction of Spanish developer Mercury Steam that Metroid's action-orientated identity has solidified. First with a remake of the Game Boy's Return of Samus, but also with their more recent title. 2021's Metroid Dread is a sequel both to the story and mechanics of Metroid Fusion, picking up with our bounty hunter eradicating the last of the X-Parasite in a new locale. Samus' smooth navigation is further improved by auto-clambering over obstacles and a new ability to slide under small gaps. Her active combat options have also increased with the inclusion of parrying, which stuns enemies and opens them up to a one-hit kill. This increase in movement and combat prowess feeds into Dread's evolution on Fusion's terror, as the game also includes a number of encounters with one-hit kill enemies that change Samus' behaviour from an active fighter to a reactive survivor. As well as the need to actively run away from these entities, new abilities like an invisibility cloak and short-range boost, both tied to a finite resource, are designed to give her a slight chance to escape entrapment. It makes Metroid almost more like a Resident Evil game, which is ironic considering that Prime's nearest familiar is the recent first-person RE games. It's another unique set-piece type that sits within the Fusion style of short, set-piece driven progress. Sometimes Samus will be doing a little bit of exploration, or a boss battle, or evading an unstoppable enemy. This has created an interesting schism between the Prime sub-series and the main Metroid series, and yet this move towards a more action-orientated gameplay style has also happened across the Prime trilogy and its spin-offs. The third game fully embraces a Fusion-like structure, even down to putting ice in its missiles, but this shift was noticeable in Metroid Prime 2. Not just because its bosses are also designed around Samus' iconic abilities. First-person shooting was given a little more juice with Echoes' Ikaruga-inspired beam system, where enemies reacted differently to either light or dark attacks. Each of these beams was tied to a finite resource, opening a decision for players whether to stick with the always available power beam or to use the stronger weapons in combat scenarios. It's a situation similar to whether a player sticks with a weaker weapon with lots of ammo available, or breaks out the big guns. It was with Metroid Prime Hunters that Prime fully embraced its first-person shooter credentials, shifting focus from exploring elaborately planned worlds to instead duking it out with her fellow bounty hunters in Quake-style arenas. Before the Wii trilogy, this was the first game to broach a more FPS-like control scheme, with a combination of the face buttons, D-pad and Nintendo DS touchscreen used to independently move and aim Samus. An early hit for the DS, its status as a spin-off allowed fans to more fully embrace a shift from a less brainy to a more blasty style of gameplay. That can't be said unfortunately for Metroid Prime Federation Force, though granted that's because it was the first Metroid game seen in the wilderness years between Other M and Samus Returns. It's with those two games though that Metroid Prime's most iconic elements are at the forefront. The scan visor is included in both, as are the lovingly written lore entries on item drops, enemies, and long-lost civilizations. Even if the developers of Metroid Prime 4 decided to throw everything out the window, this is the kitchen sink that remains core to the series. Alongside the need to have Samus Aran as a protagonist, the first-person perspective, and the Metroid-like progression of opening up new areas with cool new items. Importantly, none of this is antithetical to Samus' shift from a silent warrior to a more active protagonist. And in fact, Metroid Prime 4 could be the chance to synthesize these elements together. Should Metroid Prime 4 be a more action-orientated game inspired not just by modern FPS expectations, but also Samus' new identity? Or should she remain a quiet investigator that explores long-deserted planets to unravel strange conspiracies? Well, in the immortal words of the little girl from the old El Paso advert,
¿Por qué no las dos?
Much of Metroid's design was formed by technical limitations, but it's with the power of the Nintendo Switch that we can see a Metroid game that literally can achieve both once. The remaster already achieves much of this with its new control scheme. It also eliminates many of the technical shortcomings that inform some of Prime's offending design decisions, like faster loading times avoiding the need for so many doors. The Switch is also home to Metroid Dread, which uses the console's transformable nature as both a portable and home system to flex between being a Super Metroid and Fusion-inspired adventure. Prime 4 then can be the synthesis between the antithetical Fusion-inspired games and the synthetic Prime trilogy. But what exactly does that look like in practice? Unfortunately, I don't know how to use a games engine, so, well, you'll have to make do with rough sketches and videos from here on out. If Metroid Prime 4 was to pick up from Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, as I'm sure the plot will, streamlining beams into additive upgrades and focusing on the interplay between the combat and scan visors is a good starting point for improvement. Rather than adding new single-use abilities, Corruption found ways to make the rest of Samus' moveset more robust. The grappling beam could now be used in combat, her missiles now had an elemental freezing effect and could track multiple targets, and the Morph Ball had more utility beyond just laying bombs. Metroid Dread cleverly retained many of these quirks, and added a few more like the grapple beam's ability to move blocks towards Samus. Prime 4 then should add more quirks. Grappling should bring entities into a range the same way beams move them out, creating a more dynamic battlefield. Being able to turn into a Morph Ball should also give Samus some ability to sneak past enemies. By streamlining a number of opportunities into the same abilities, not only does it give players more options, but it importantly frees up buttons on the controller. During combat, players will want to keep their thumbs on the sticks and fingers on the shoulders and triggers, meaning there's only 6 potential abilities that could be activated. If we keep beams on ZR, missiles on R, lock on ZL, which could activate the grapple, and jumping on L, that leaves of course clicking in the sticks, which opens up some new opportunities. Brand new abilities are the most exciting aspects in a new Metroid game, as we're seeing old abilities return in 3D in the Prime games. What nearly all of them had in common was that they fed into these games' overall tone and Samus' identity therein. It makes sense, a developer creates new problems and this new ability solves them. As stated, Metroid Dread features the ability to turn invisible and quickly evade attacks, which become vital during its ME sections. Metroid Prime 4 then should look to weld the schism between the two flavours of Metroid, so let's take a look at how each could be serviced. If Metroid Prime 4 and Samus are to take a more action-driven identity inspired by Metroid Dread, there's a few inspirations Retro could look at. Games like Titanfall 2, Dying Light, and the 2016 version of Doom have included mechanics designed for streamlined movement through environments. Much like Samus can clamber over obstacles in Dread, a similar system should be implemented in Prime 4 so she can pull herself up ledges, pass over hurdles, and slide under obstacles. Although a melee system might be too much, the ability to parry enemy attacks similar to Samus's counter in Dread would open new combat opportunities, and reward players who want to master its timing so Samus avoids taking damage and gets an additional drop in return. Finally, although controversial, perhaps the developers can finally make the speed booster work in first person. The ability to sprint has been common in FPS games, and its inclusion in Prime would be silly outside of making backtracking a little faster. However, the developers could integrate a more robust speed boost with their combat and movement options. For example, allowing her to spine shark towards obstacles similar to the blink ability of Dishonored, or football tackle enemies to create distance. It'd also be another means to destroy weak walls and open doors that I'm sure the developers would appreciate. On a similar note, Metroid Prime 4 should address one of the big issues with the Prime Remaster's brand new control scheme. In the GameCube original, tapping the A button would shoot a single shot, whilst holding it down would charge a larger shot. However, the remaster moves the shoot button to the FPS and to ZR trigger. This is part of what makes the dual stick control scheme possible. Having weapon fire on a trigger makes sense in a game with traditional weapons, where holding down the trigger unloads a clip. But in Metroid Prime, holding that trigger down instead charges shots. Constantly pumping a finger is an exhausting movement to fire individual shots, and the remaster tries to alleviate this a little bit by having a few shots go off before Samus starts charging. However, Metroid Prime 4 could remedy this issue with an entirely new beam upgrade, the Rapid Beam, where constant power shots are released. It wouldn't be as powerful as, say, a singular or charged shot, but it would allow the player to put some space between Samus and her enemies, similar to how machine guns are used in other titles. Instead of multiple beam types, there could be different beam configurations to be cycled with the left and right D-pad buttons. Rapid shots, charged shots, and precision shots, for example. This would go some way of making good on the original promise of beams in that they were recreating the effects of weapon types from other FPS games. In a funny way, it gives Samus's arm cannon a similar utility to a washer hose, with a bunch of different nozzles on it. On the other hand, if Retro Studios were to focus on Samus's more investigative mind, then perhaps the scan visor could be made into a more robust feature. Elements from the X-ray or thermal visor could be grandfathered in as upgrades for the scan, perhaps allowing Samus to ping the environment to find objects behind walls or hidden to the naked eye. The ping could also highlight objects of interest in an environment, activate switches, and colour in destructible objects. This would leave the scan then to focus on the good stuff, lore and morphology. This is where Metroid Prime 4 could and should take something from its contemporaries. Batman Arkham Asylum used its scan visor to not only scan objects for lore, but it also got additional use as a means to track enemies and even solve puzzles. There's very little difference between being a great detective and a great bounty hunter, so why not have the scan visor actually factor into some of that exploration? Although it's unlikely there's a Riddler in deep space who spray paints question marks that neatly overlap, there's a great opportunity in using lore snippets as clues for where to go next, or give clues for upcoming threats. To take an example from Metroid Other M, Samus uses her visor in one instance to track the footprints of an enemy she's currently pursuing. It'd be cool if, as part of scanning a monster's morphology, to perhaps track prints to find their eating grounds. To take maybe the coolest idea from Batman Arkham Origins, Samus could use her visor to reconstruct crime scenes with information derived from scanning. This would let the game take a slower pace in some parts so players can more directly involve themselves with pulling apart a conspiracy, creating an even stronger connection to Samus and this new alien world. What's cool is that these new suggested abilities don't cancel each other out. Like Samus in combat mode, scan mode, and morph ball mode, they all shift gears without massively reworking Metroid Prime, and yet provide different tasting menus for players to appreciate. Of course, abilities are only as useful as the world they're employed in. The developers should hopefully have the time to build a world as robust as Prime 1 and 2's, so there's hope for a return to the design of Talon 4 instead of the smaller sandboxes like the ones in Corruption, Fusion and Dread. Moving away from the lock-on based design should hopefully unshackle the level designers need to create enormous circular arenas for circular strafing also. Players would get a lot more cool geometry to explore as a result, especially if the team embraces new navigational abilities. Although Super Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild went open world, Metroid Prime 4 shouldn't do likewise. Playing the remaster, this world of small but robust biomes is one element of Prime that hasn't just stood the test of time, but has helped the game stand out amongst its competition. Metroid Prime isn't a Far Cry-like checklister, a Call of Duty spectacle shooter, and certainly not a battle royale. That lock and key system should remain at the core of its navigation, taking inspiration from the 2D Metroids to not become overly annoying towards the end of the game. If the developers could implement the same great shortcut design of Prime 2, they'd avoid the need for fast travel or a distracting waypoint system. As for pitching new locations, well, you can't go wrong with a lethal lava land or snowman's land, especially if they decide to keep Samus' aversion to the cold from later games. One feature from Fusion and Dread the developers should consider is transforming environments. In one later game beat, an area that was once placid becomes below freezing in Dread, changing geometry and navigation until Samus can rewarm it. Having opportunities like this would be awesome, and juice additional creativity out of existing environments. This leaves perhaps the most controversial element to be addressed: the plot. Something that over this video's entire runtime I've yet to fully address. The entire Metroid Prime trilogy, Hunters and Federation Force, takes place in between the events of the first and second Metroid games. In the NES game, Samus destroys Mother Brain and the space pirate base on Zebes, and in Samus Returns she goes to SR-388 to wipe out all the Metroids. In the time between those games, she pursues Space Pirate Ridley to a space pirate station, discovers a planet full of radioactive goo in her hunt, defeats a radioactive Metroid that turns into her evil doppelganger, helps a planet full of aliens that got split up by the goo, gets infected by the goo herself, and then finally eliminates all traces of the goo from the galaxy, including the doppelganger. Prime is a specifically goo-driven series, and so by eliminating it from the plot, there's only a few places Metroid Prime 4's story could go. That said, Retro has dropped a few hints over the years of what could be next. Metroid Prime Hunters and Corruption gets into the world of Samus' rival bounty hunters. In the special ending of Corruption, one of her rivals from Hunters is set up somewhat as a potential villain, and this is confirmed in Federation Force when it's revealed they have a Metroid, although no goo. Unfortunately, I can't speculate much about this character because there's honestly not enough to go on, except they look kind of cool. If Metroid Prime 4 was to follow in these games' direction, it would likely take place after Federation Force but before Metroid 2, and deal with Samus tracking down this bounty hunter. She'll likely end up on a hostile planet and forget how to turn into a ball again, as is the case with all the previous Metroids. In that sense, staying more to the look and design of Prime 1 would make sense, but doing so would create conflict with later games in the series. For example, what happened to all her cool abilities in Metroid 2? More so, this is an entirely expected plot beat, and not really something that players waiting 16 years for this game would appreciate. Metroid Prime 4 should be the synthesis of the two Metroids, brought on by the Nintendo Switch, and the plot should reflect that. Controversially, things could be incredibly interesting if instead the plot of Metroid Prime 4 picked up after the events of Metroid Dread. Not only is this the latest story beat, it's going to be the one that'll take the least amount of time to explain to new players. Samus lands on an alien planet to eliminate the last of the X-Parasites, gets ambushed by her fifth dad, unlocks her Metroid potential, eliminates everyone, and then finally has a nice chill. No more goo, no more Metroids, no more X-Parasite, leaving Samus as the baddest of them all. Samus being at this level of power is a potential narrative dead end, but Metroid games are always quick to bust it back down to size and introduce a bigger threat. This is where Retro could nicely tie into the theme set up in the Prime games. Bounty hunters are a big deal, and perhaps they're put into action to take on a now Metroid-powered Samus Aran, either on behalf of the Galactic Federation or the Space Pirates. The narrative creates great mechanical opportunities. Perhaps this new alien planet that Samus is asked to explore could be occupied by these rival entities, each worth taking domain in the biome they best fit. The Snow Hunter loves the snow, the Lava Hunter loves the lava, etc. Not only is Samus starting on the back foot in regards to losing all of her abilities, she's also going against foes who are literally in their element. Similar to the bosses of previous Metroid games, perhaps the explanation for her losing her abilities is that these hunters have stolen them and integrated them into their own abilities, giving players a taste at what they'll be able to do after Samus defies the odds. Then, to lean into the dread of Metroid Dread and elements that the newest first-person Resident Evil games have stitched into their FPA design, these hunters could be a recurring and overwhelming threat in their domains. Morphball platforming, scanning lore, and creature combat could be joined by or even interrupted by combat with these humanoid hunters, causing a shift in gameplay mentality. Should Samus run to protect herself, or instead fight back? Perhaps Samus' scan visor doesn't know certain bounty hunters, and instead the player must piece together not only their identity, but ways to defeat them through lore snippets and investigation. This Samus vs Hunter concept was experimented with in the DS game, but with a polygon budget and a control scheme that didn't quite pull it off. Prime 4 could finally make these encounters work, similar to how the Emmys of Dread were finally achieved on Switch hardware. Although the Primes eventually introduced more entities into the world, the fun of a Metroid game is still Samus as a lone badass, and so these hunters should be used sparingly as a result. A colour on the palette, rather than an entire paint bucket to dump over Metroid Prime 4. The developers at Retro should use the opportunity of a 16-year break not just to tie up loose ends, but give Metroid Prime a refresh. Dread left things on a note of potentially new Metroid stories to come, and Prime 4 could very easily do the same. Beyond Metroid's X-Parasites and radioactive goo that no longer exists, giving these hunters enough intrigue opens up opportunities for games to further explore them, which gives the world of Metroid some much needed longevity. Also, if Retro Studio needs a name for this game, why not Metroid Prime Dread Hunters? All of these additional hunters raise one final question. Should the game include multiplayer? Metroid Prime Hunters was built around the concept, leveraging the DS's Wi-Fi capabilities so players could face off across a room or across the globe. Metroid Prime 2, a mainline game, also included a multiplayer mode, though one that was a little less robust. The short answer is probably not. There are other FPS games on the market that are exclusively multiplayer, and as is the nature of games development, time that could be spent on a side mode could also go into main development. However, especially if the developers reboot some of Samus' control, a multiplayer mode could be an exciting inclusion. It's the one thing that Nintendo don't have in their repertoire, outside of Splatoon's third-person shooting, and so it opens a fun opportunity to expand the Metroid experience, and give the game some longevity long after the credits have rolled. Metroid Prime 4 is Nintendo and Retro Studios' opportunity not just to make good on the Prime 1 remaster, but to introduce an entirely new base of players into one of gaming's greatest series. Throughout, I've done my best to keep my suggestions not only achievable, but to the core of why Metroid Prime and Samus Aran are beloved by the gaming community. For the former, there really is no other FPS game that follows a Metroid formula of exploration and lock and key design, as well as all the cool investigation and story approaches of its scan visor. As for Samus, she's one of the few video game protagonists that has remained cool for almost 40 years, evolving not just as technology improves, but in response to creative opportunities. Metroid Prime 4 could be the game that mends the schism created in the wake of Super Metroid's enormous influence, creating a Metroid game that can literally do both what Prime and the post-Fusion 2D games have done so well. There's plenty that can be polished up from both titles, and the remaster has already gone to some extent of making Metroid Prime more palatable to a modern audience. But there's so much more that can be achieved. Samus Aran is a warrior, investigator, spelunker, sometimes a pinball, and the Metroid games are at their best when all these elements are finely balanced. While Metroid Prime 4 will make these elements more robust, it shouldn't be afraid to experiment also. Dread introduced survival horror elements into its gameplay, and Metroid Prime Hunters introduced, well, bounty hunters. While I can imagine both these elements could make their way into Prime 4, what's most exciting is what can't be predicted. There's still a lot of unknowns around how the story of Metroid Prime can be restarted after its big narrative concept was destroyed, but then that's part of the fun of sticking with it for almost 20 years. All we can hope is that it was worth the wait. That said, I do hope they copy Super Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild and let me play Suit Dress Up with Samus. If you have thoughts about what Metroid Prime 4 could look like, sound off in the comments below to share your ideas. Otherwise, I've been James, and I'll see you all in the next upload.